The following program is sponsored by CBN.
Coming up, our northern neighbors are aiming to be the first post-Western nation.
You stand for everybody.
But are they just clamping down on Christianity?
She was being shamed for being too Christian.
And opening the doors to radical Islam.
Now we see those Islamists roaming around.
Plus, two doctors working to bring medical care to a continent in crisis. See how they're helping out halfway around the world on today's 700 Club.
Welcome to the 700 Club. You know, isn't it bizarre? It started out with a discredited British spook who wrote what was called a Fusion GPS document alleging that the Russians were trying to influence the election by negotiating with the Trump campaign. And so there was a hue and cry to get to the bottom of it. Alan Dershowitz of Harvard made a very brilliant suggestion. Why don't you have a commission to do that? But without the knowledge of the president, because the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, had recused himself, his assistant appointed a special prosecutor who happened to be a former FBI guy who was a buddy of all the FBI people. And they asked for so-called FISA warrants from judges, and they used to get those warrants to spy on Americans from a FISA court. They used this Fusion GPS phony document that it turned out had been paid for by the Democratic Party. Now, that's where it came. All right, the head of the FBI was before Congress yesterday, and they asked him, well, could you tell us about that document? I don't know. Can you tell us who led that? I don't know. Is it an honest document? I don't know. I mean, here's the head of the FBI, what did he say, 240 times or something? He said, I can't remember, I don't know. I mean, he's the guy that led the charge. Okay, so they've got all this stuff going. Now they have a fellow named Robert Mueller who's doing this thing, supposedly found out about Russian involvement. But what has he done? He's begun to go into the personal finances of the attorney for the President of the United States. And they violated something that I always thought was sacrosanct. That was what's called the attorney-client privilege. And that's something that was never, judge would never open up. Opposing counsel could never ask. They could say, well, that's attorney-client, and that is sanctity. It's like the confession of a Catholic before a priest. But now Michael Cohen, who was the lawyer for the president, his office was attached by the FBI. They seized all of his personal files and took them into custody, and then they let people begin to look at his files. And now he's been sentenced, and the whole thing is bizarre. You say, what in the world is happening? But it looks like the Justice Department and the people who hated Donald Trump, especially in the FBI, there were several who have themselves been fired or indicted, who wanted to get the president and keep him from being the president of the United States. And so you've got this thing going on now. They say, well, there were hush money payments given to Michael Cohen, who in turn paid them, one to the National Enquirer, and then the other was a Karen McDougal, who's a former playmate or whatever, and this Stormy Daniels, who was a porn star. And apparently the president, we don't know what went on, but he said, I didn't do anything, but he gave money to Cohen. Cohen in turn gives it to the ladies. So now they're saying that's a federal crime. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It's so hard to parse these things. It's so complicated. But whatever it is, a judge sentenced Michael Cohen.
He did, to 3 years in prison for financial crimes and for violating campaign finance laws. After that, the National Enquirer, of all places, made a surprise announcement. CBN's Jenna Browder brings us the story from Washington.
Just 2 hours after Michael Cohen was sentenced, another bombshell. The parent company of the National Enquirer, AMI, cut a deal with prosecutors, admitting to helping the Trump campaign cover up allegations of an affair. Feds agreed not to prosecute if the head of AMI agreed to cooperate. The company admitted to paying Karen McDougal $150,000 in concert with the Trump campaign to bury her story. Prosecutors say that and Cohen's testimony that he paid $130,000 to Stormy Daniels for the same reason amount to illegal campaign contributions, which is a felony.
There were real feelings between the two of us.
It all hinges on if the president knew the payments were being made and if he did it to protect his campaign. In a similar case involving presidential candidate John Edwards, a jury did not find he violated campaign finance laws. Senator Richard Blumenthal last night.
The term co-conspirator is beginning to fit Donald Trump like a well-tailored suit.
Senator Lindsey Graham, though, played down the fallout.
I don't know if it means a whole lot for the president. It means a lot in Michael Cohen's life. Anytime a former lawyer of yours goes to jail is probably not a good day, but I've yet to see any evidence coming from Mr. Cohen of collusion, and that's what started the Mueller investigation to begin with.
Cohen is still working with prosecutors and is prepared to testify before Congress if called. Yesterday he said, quote, "I felt it was my duty to cover up his dirty deeds rather than listen to my own inner voice and my moral compass. My weakness can be characterized as a blind loyalty to Donald Trump." Meantime, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team says he has, quote, "provided consistent and credible information about core Russia-related issues under investigation." It's possible Cohen could have his sentence reduced if he tells more. So far, silence from the White House. But President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, did have this to say to Yahoo News. Quote, "Cohen is a completely dishonorable person. I've never heard of a lawyer that tape recorded their client without the client's permission." Going on to add, the president's not a lawyer. The simple fact is that it's not a criminal violation of the campaign finance law. And in another development, a federal judge ordered Mueller to turn over documents related to the questioning of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. This after Flynn's legal team said the FBI pressured him not to bring a lawyer to an interview with agents at the White House. There's talk of impeachment, but President Trump says he's not concerned, and he thinks people would, quote, revolt if that happened. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Well, I don't know, but ladies and gentlemen, if you feel as I do, I think we've got to get together for this country. And this kind of unseemly stuff that goes on, but without question, we've got Strzok and Lisa Page sending emails back and forth. How can we get Trump? How can we discredit him? How can we keep him from being president? There's no doubt. And then a former head of the FBI has been discredited. And now Comey has claimed amnesia. It's unbelievable in those hearings. But the biggest thing is what are these payments anything? But the fact that the lawyer says I was blindly loyal, and as Rudy Giuliani says, a blindly loyal lawyer does not tape the statements and the conversations he has with his client. That just is not done. And if it is done under any circumstances, it would never be made public. But that part of the legal system has been shredded to pieces by these investigations. And I think that some judge ought to step in and say, this is wrong. What's being done is, I don't care what you think about the president, but that should never happen. A man should be able to talk to his attorney in confidence. And that's one of the pillars of the legal system we have in America. And they have violated it, and it's wrong. It's just flat wrong. Well, in other news, Nancy Pelosi is trying to put down a rebellion in her party. John Jessup has more on that.
That's right, Pat. Pelosi is promising to limit her time as House Speaker to just 4 years. The current minority leader, who's 78 years old, made the offer to Democrats who say it's time for fresher faces to take over. The deal also applies to her deputies Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn, both men also in their late 70s. The agreement is expected to clear the way for her to take the Speaker's post next month. Well, the Senate will vote early next year on President Trump's pick for Attorney General. Bill Barr held the post in the 1990s under President George H.W. Bush. Amber Strong brings us this look at Barr and explains why some conservatives are hopeful about his appointment.
With a resume dating back to the 1970s as a CIA analyst, William Barr is a staple around Washington. In the early 80s, he began work for President Reagan, eventually serving as Attorney General for Bush 41.
Respected by Republicans and respected by Democrats.
During his career, the 68-year-old served as a boss to Robert Mueller and on the General Counsel for Verizon. His views on issues such as Roe v. Wade and immigration excite many Republicans, and conservatives are hopeful he'll bring stability to an embattled DOJ.
The establishment's going to be asking the question, will Bill Barr be brave enough to stand up to President Trump? Frankly, the question should be, will Bill Barr be brave enough to stand up for President Trump?
And that's the very thing that has some on the left and the right concerned, particularly when it comes to past statements from Barr seeming to criticize aspects of the Mueller investigation.
I'm glad the president has nominated someone with relevant experience in the department. What I'll be looking for is, will he be working to guarantee the independence of the Department of Justice?
Barr's received praise for his thoughts on counterterrorism post 9/11, but that too could be an issue.
I'm concerned that he's been a big supporter of the Patriot Act, which lowered the standard for spying on Americans, and he even went so far as to say, you know, the Patriot Act was pretty good, but we should go much further.
Even still, most Republicans are confident it will be an easy confirmation.
It shouldn't be all that difficult. This is someone who has a long record in public life. My guess is that when it's all said and done, when it comes to a vote in the full Senate, that he'll have strong support.
No date yet on that confirmation, but it's likely to take place in early 2019. Amber Strong, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Amber. Pat, did you think this was a great pick?
Well, I think he's a superb pick because he served with distinction before. He was, I think they approved him on a voice vote. He's so popular, and he has headed the Justice Department. He knows how to do it. He's experienced, and so you're not some amateur going in there, but he's made some very strong statements that I think bode well for his tenure. And I do know that Jay Sekulow and others have warmly supported him. I remember in Virginia, he was somewhat active in the old days in the Republican Party in Virginia and was highly thought of. And I think he's going to make a superb choice, is a superb choice as Attorney General. But, you know, I just don't understand this business about the independence of the Justice Department. They are a branch of government. The government, they report to the President of the United States. And I don't know where we get the idea that they're supposed to be independent. Who's going to control them? To whom does the Attorney General report? And it has been suggested that we should split the office, that there should be one who's going to be the lawyer for the president and the other who's going to be running the Justice Department. But as it is, we've got two people, and the Attorney General, among other things, is the confidant and a lawyer for the president. And at the same time, he's supposed to run the Justice Department. And it's a difficult situation. But they're not supposed, as I understand it, the Justice Department is not some independent branch that doesn't have a head. I mean, it's got the situation we have, everybody has to report to somebody. And in the Justice Department, the Attorney General is the head of the Justice Department, and he in turn reports to the President of the United States. And to say, well, they're supposed to be independent is nonsense. Whew. Oh, enough. It's going to be Christmas. Hey, ho, ho, ho. Happy stockings and mistletoe and all that.
Heartfelt, huh?
Yeah. Okay. All right. John.
Well, Well, Pat, no stockings or mistletoe in this next story. As President Trump reimposed harsh economic sanctions on Iran last month, Iranian hackers scrambled to break into the personal emails of American officials tasked with enforcing them. According to the Associated Press, a London-based cybersecurity group found the hackers tried to break into the emails of Treasury officials, D.C. think tanks, and other key figures. The AP says it's more evidence of the ongoing cyber war between the United States and Iran. Well, 2 Israelis were killed in a terrorist shooting in biblical Samaria today. It's the third such attack in less than a week. But Israel's threats go beyond Palestinian terrorists. It's also fighting a hidden threat on its northern border. Chris Mitchell reports on the IDF's discovery of more terror tunnels running from Lebanon into Israel.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a warning to Hezbollah during a visit to Israeli troops in the north.
Our deployment is ready for a strong response if Hezbollah makes a big mistake and decides to harm us or to resist the operation we're conducting. They will be hit in such a way that they cannot even imagine.
Israeli soldiers dismantling the tunnels released a recording of the classified technology to detect them. Meanwhile, a Hezbollah leader boasted all of Israel is within range of its missiles. Sheikh Naim Qassem said there is not a single point in the occupied territories out of reach of Hezbollah's missiles. The Zionists cannot tolerate such a high level of threats in confrontation with Hezbollah, which is why they have no motive for entering another war with Lebanon. Israel's chief of military intelligence warned lawmakers that while the risk of war is low, the potential exists for circumstances to escalate out of control. Lebanon's president downplayed the danger.
Israel has informed us through the United States that there are no aggressive intentions, and it will continue to work inside its territories. We, too, have no aggressive intentions.
The tunnels, however, appear to be part of an aggressive strategy by Hezbollah. Israel says the tunnels violate the UN resolution that ended the 2006 Second Lebanon War that prohibited Hezbollah from a military buildup. Since then, however, Hezbollah missiles have increased about tenfold to some 150,000, giving the terror group more military firepower than 95% of countries in the world. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Pat, back to you.
You know, the United Nations is a toothless tiger. And after that other war, when I had the privilege of being there while those rockets were being fired, the UN moved in and said, all right, we're going to impose sanctions, and we're not going to let these people arm anymore. We're not going to let them build up anymore, and we guarantee the security of Israel. Baloney! No such thing happened. And now Hezbollah has got many, many more rockets, much more sophisticated rockets, much better guidance systems, and now they're building tunnels to bring in supplies and personnel from the north to invade Israel. They've got everything set up, and it's always in violation, and the UN has done nothing. And what I have suggested, and I do it again, we need a substitute for the United Nations. It is nothing but a sounding board for terrorists and anti-Israeli and anti-American propaganda. The General Assembly is toothless, and the Security Council, you know what happened if it isn't for the vote of the United States, which has a veto power, that whole thing would run away from us, and the Obama administration refuses to act on one initiative, and they let a resolution go through that was very damaging to Israel. We ought to redo that thing. I mean, it's World War II. It's used its usefulness, and we should stop supporting it. We ought to go for a community of democratic nations that doesn't include all these dictatorships and these little penny-ante countries that don't amount to much. I think the time has come, but this is a time the United Nations should have acted. They should have moved in. They should have restricted Hezbollah. They have done nothing, and yet that buildup is there, and it is extremely dangerous to Israel. I don't know how they're going to get away from having a preemptive war. Sooner or later, Israel is going to be forced to strike, or else its existence is going to be put in jeopardy. Terry.
Well, coming up, we're going to take you to a country that's rolling out the welcome mat to ISIS members. And it's not in the Middle East, it's Canada.
The white left liberal feminist class would sit in ringside seats and say, how lovely.
Why the Canadians are embarking on this radical national experiment when we come back.
I was having symptoms of heartburn. I was out of breath a lot, and that wasn't me. I never thought that it would be cancer for me. When I spoke to my oncologist at Cancer Treatment Center of America, he recommended that I see some of the clinicians there. It was a team of people working together, taking care of not just the medical part, but also the mental part, the emotional part, the spiritual part.
If you or someone you love has been diagnosed with cancer, go to cancercenter.com to explore treatment options and the many ways spiritual support helps our patients find the strength and hope they need.
Cancer Treatment Center of America really understands the journey and just lift you up so you can be able to fight this disease. I'm determined to fulfill my purpose in life.
Call or go to cancercenter.com. Cancer Treatment Centers of America, Comprehensive Cancer Care Network. Appointments available now.
Well, people pay the price for the leaders they elect, and it seems that our neighbors to the north are having an identity crisis. Canada has embarked on a radical national experiment, and those profound changes could lead them down a dangerous road. Our reporter Dale Hurd again has a very insightful analysis of what's going on.
When Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his country is a post-national state and has no core identity, no one should be surprised when some start asking if Canada is even a country. But the identity crisis facing Canada is not only multifaceted, it's serious and could one day have a direct impact on the United States. Canada is in the midst of, as one writer put it, a civilizational experiment that's transforming a Western nation into a post-Western nation. And this revolution is centered around the cult of diversity.
Your Canada.
Here's one version of Justin Trudeau's post-national, post-Western Canada, transformed by diversity.
Oh, Canada, you stand for everybody.
The question is not whether Canada should welcome immigrants. The question, according to Toronto Sun columnist and SiriusXM Canada host Anthony Furey, is whose values should win the day.
In Canada right now, it's labeled bizarrely xenophobic and anti-immigrant, and they throw around terms like racism to no end. If you simply say, I'd like us all to integrate here and live together in a compatible way.
Throughout their histories, both Canada and America have welcomed immigrants of all backgrounds. But Canada, rather than being a melting pot like the U.S., has said that it is a mosaic of many cultures. The problem begins when the Canadian mosaic includes more and more radical Islamists who favor undemocratic values under Sharia law. Prime Minister Trudeau welcomed almost 50,000 refugees from the Middle East in 2016 alone, and has even welcomed returning ISIS fighters, saying in an interview that they could be a powerful voice.
And a lot of people, probably the silent majority, are saying, I'm unhappy with this, including new immigrants who came to Canada, whether it's a year ago or a decade or 3 decades ago, who say, no, I came to Canada for a reason, because I wanted Canadian values and I was escaping values in other countries.
One immigrant who would like more Canadian values is pro-Western Muslim Tahir Gora, founder of Tag TV in Toronto, a network with a large international audience. He's also a co-author of Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America.
I moved to this beautiful country because of its Canadian culture. People like me escaped Pakistan or Middle East or the Muslim world, came to Canada, and some went to United States with the hope that they will be left alone by those radical Islamists. But now we see those Islamists roaming around in this part of the world.
Tariq Fatah is a journalist, writer, and founder of the Muslim Canadian Congress. An immigrant from Pakistan and a proud Canadian, Fatah says the Canadian left, which in his words is sinking in white guilt, now accepts and even celebrates undemocratic radical Islamic beliefs and practices. He likens it to a circus.
It considers radical Islam as a phenomena that needs to be embraced because it is so curious. So we as Muslims are considered as circus animals. We need to perform in a way. And the white left liberal feminist class would sit in ringside seats and say, ah, how lovely. Just look at that monkey jump up and down. Or that elephant stood up on his 2 feet. Honey, did you see that? Oh, it's breathtaking.
Another facet of Canada's identity crisis can be seen in the growing trend of what are called land acknowledgements.
We want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on which Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses sit.
Land acknowledgements are recited daily on campuses and in schools across Canada, and they essentially declare that Canada is an occupier.
We respectfully acknowledge the territory
in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland,
as the ancestral homelands
of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk.
These continue even though a poll this year found that most Canadians do not believe Native peoples should have a special status and that the government should stop apologizing for past wrongs. The culture that is under fire here is traditional Canadian Christian culture. Ottawa resident Alexandra Belair grew up behind the Iron Curtain in communist Czechoslovakia, and she sees some disturbing parallels between life under communism and life in politically correct Canada. What do you say to someone who says, that's preposterous, I can say whatever I want in Canada? How can you compare it to the Soviet world?
But you can't say anything you want. Because I was a daughter of a political dissident, teachers would take the time to berate me and say bad things about me in front of the whole classroom, because that way they were proving they weren't showing favoritism to the dissident's daughter, right? Now my friend's daughter was in school and she was being shamed for being too Christian. How's that different? How is that different? She was being shamed for feeling very patriotic Canadian. How is that different for being shamed for being a dissident's daughter?
There's a saying here that the world needs more Canada. But if current trends continue, the world is going to get less of Canada, as Canadian identity is swallowed up in a left-wing multicultural experiment. Dale Hurd, CBN News, in Toronto and Ottawa.
Thanks, Dale. Well, the book is called Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America. And you can find it wherever books are sold. Dale, good work as usual. Terry?
Well, still ahead, a pair of doctors who are gathering physicians from around the world and taking them to an area where people are dying because of a lack of health care. They'll share their life-changing stories when we come back. Well, you still have time to save on your taxes for 2018. Your gift to CBN is tax deductible, so you can help change lives here in America and all around the world, and at the same time take advantage of year-end tax savings. And if you'd like to do that, or if you need more information on how to do that, call our toll-free number. It's 1-800-700-7000, or of course you can go to cbn.com. Well, picture an area the size of Louisiana and imagine that the people there only had one qualified physician on duty. In some parts of Africa, that is the sad reality. And that's why two doctors are stepping out of their comfort zones and, in doing so, hopefully changing the fate of a continent. Take a look.
56 million people in Africa are in need of surgical care, and many are dying because of the lack of it. Dr. Paul Osteen is the founder of M3 Mobilizing Medical Missions. Dr. Keir Thielander is the CMO of the Pan-African Academy of Christian Surgeons. Together, they are addressing this healthcare crisis. The upcoming M3 Mobilizing Medical Missions Conference brings together doctors, nurses, dentists, and anyone wanting to make a difference in meeting these pressing needs.
Doctors Paul Osteen and Keir Thielander are here with us now, and we welcome you both to the show today.
Thank you.
How serious is the problem, Paul?
Oh, goodness. 5 billion people in the world don't have access to safe and affordable surgery. So people die of just simple, easily treatable, conditions and it just breaks your heart.
It does break your heart. Keir, what compelled you to do this work?
Yeah, so training and discipleship. Back in the early 2000s, it was obvious to me that God was calling me to do training and to do discipleship together. It's not one or the other, it was both. And so to do surgical training and discipleship, that's what God called me to do.
Tell me about the M3 medical mission. What are they doing? What's it about?
Well, what I want to do is I want to introduce people to the opportunities that I never knew existed. Mm-hmm. So when I went through medical school and my training, and then even early in my practice, I didn't know that there were real opportunities and sustainable mission efforts all around the world. There are small mission hospitals all around sub-Saharan Africa that need help. And I'm compelled to go and to relieve those missionary surgeons. So the point of M3 is simply to let people know that there are ways they can use their gifts and their skills to tell people about Jesus and to advance the kingdom.
It must be so satisfying because, so many times here in the United States, there are so many rules and regulations and legalities and things that, as a doctor, I'm not medically educated, but if I were a doctor, I would think it would be so wonderful to get to the place where you could actually go to the need and see what you're doing making a difference. Keir, talk a little bit about, you're the CMO of PAX. How are you addressing the health crisis in Africa?
Yeah, so the health crisis, the main thing that you need is personnel. And so we're training and discipling Christian doctors to become surgeons, to be leaders in their communities, to be leaders in their countries and in the healthcare system.
So you're working with nationals in that regard.
Absolutely, and that's what we do.
So tell me, for both of you in your calling, what some of the challenges are that you face. I know personnel obviously is one of them, but what else would you say, Paul?
Well, I think sometimes, we live in a broken and complicated world, and sometimes the needs and just the heaviness of that can get you down. But what we've found is just take your 5 loaves and 2 fish and see what Jesus can do with it. You don't have to solve the whole problem, but take part of that problem and do what you can to help one person at a time. And it's interesting, when you put your 5 loaves in Jesus' hands, it's amazing how he can use that.
Keir, do you ever struggle with that, with not looking at the intensity and immensity of the big picture and just kind of staying on what's God calling me to today?
Yeah, it's a daily challenge to figure out, Lord, what do you want me to do right at this moment? You can get overwhelmed by 5 billion people, or 56 million in sub-Saharan Africa who need surgery right today, right now. They would already have had surgery if they lived in the United States. And so just to focus on what do I need to do today to support the people that I'm helping to do training and discipleship to share the good news of Jesus with a continent that is in desperate need.
And you're, in what you just said, giving some amazing statistics that are reality, but just seeing it every day is so heartbreaking. How do you keep your heart right, stay above the fray, and press on?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think just your personal walk with Jesus, you just realize, it may be exhausting, it may be difficult, it may be burdensome spiritually, but it's also very satisfying when you're doing what you can in a big problem. Yeah. And that's all Jesus asks us to do. I love Matthew 25. He said, whatever you do. Mm-hmm. Didn't say you have to solve the problem. Whatever you do, when you care for the sick and clothe the naked and feed the hungry and care for the thirsty, or give water to the thirsty.
I always say, whatever he's put right in front of you in your path, that's your job today.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So, Keir, how can people help with the needs over there? I mean, we sit comfortably because God has blessed us so here in the United States, but many, many people have a deep heart for what's going on. How can we help?
Yeah, as physicians or surgeons, certainly volunteer, come to the M3 conference and learn about how you can plug in. Go to a PAX site, spend a couple weeks, or spend your next 5 years or 10 years. We would love that. Other ways to get involved, obviously to give financially. This it's not a cheap endeavor, but this is what God's called us to. And finally, pray for us, for sure. Pray for PAX and what God is doing through PAX on the continent of Africa.
And tell me about the M3 conference before we...
Well, with three goals: to engage people, connect people that have a heart to serve people, let them be inspired as they hear from people who are in the field, like Dr. Thielander. And the third thing is there'll be, around that big bowl of the church, there'll be 70 ministry organizations that need help.
Wow.
So you know what? You can come, you can connect with people, you can be inspired, but you can also find your mission there at M3.
And you're looking for all kinds of medical people, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. Nurses, doctors, all the medical fields.
All of them. So wonderful opportunity. That's what we see. It's the next M3 conference. It's going to be in February at Lakewood Church. That's in Houston, so you don't have to go halfway around the world to be part of that. And you can get more information by going to cbn.com. So Drs. Paul Osteen and Keir Thelander, thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for what you do. You're out there making a difference.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful to have you here. Well, coming up later, we're going to open up our inbox for another round of your questions and some honest answers. Roxanne says, I'm part of a healthcare workers union. What does the Bible say about going on strike? Pat's going to weigh in on that more, but first, our Christmas gift to you. The Regent Singers are in studio, and they're going to celebrate the season with a live performance of a few holiday favorites.
Praise to God, whose love was shown, who sent his Son to earth. Jesus left his rightful throne, became a man by birth, the Virgin Mary.
Welcome back to Washington. For this CBN News break, police are searching France and neighboring Germany for the suspect who attacked a Christmas market near Strasbourg Tuesday. 2 people died and another is brain dead, and about a dozen were wounded in the shooting. More than 700 officers are deployed in the manhunt for 29-year-old Sharif Chakat, a criminal believed to have been radicalized while in prison. He reportedly shouted, "God is great" in Arabic before opening fire. The nation is on high alert with another 1,800 soldiers deployed to patrol the streets. Officials are asking protesters to suspend their demonstrations. Well, British Prime Minister Theresa May survived a no-confidence vote from her own party Wednesday. 200 party members supported her, while 117 voted against, a higher number than expected. Before the vote, May pledged not to seek another term. She's faced harsh criticism for her handling of the Brexit negotiations. That's Britain's plan to leave the European Union. Now she's trying to renegotiate the deal, but analysts say in her weakened position, there's not much hope to improve the agreement. Well, you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com. Pat and Terry will be back with more of the 700 Club right after this.
A couple of weeks ago, I was thrilled to go to a concert of sacred music presented by Regent University. And they had choral groups and a choir that was just outstanding. And I was so pleased. They do so many wonderful things at Regent, but I wanted you to hear some of the music because I enjoyed it so much. It happened to be in honor of they did a program in honor of my wife's birthday, and it was dedicated to her. But this is the Regent Choir, and they're here, the Regent University Singers, and they're performing a medley of Christmas songs that I hope will make you enjoy the holidays even more. So would you please welcome the Regent Singers.
Wonderful Counselor, Lord of life, Lord of all. He is the Prince of Peace, mighty God, Holy One. Emmanuel, 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 Emmanuel. Wonderful Counselor, Lord of life, Lord of all. He is the Prince of Peace, mighty God, Holy One. Emmanuel, Emmanuel. is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessings of His heaven. We hear the Christmas angels, the great glad tidings tell. Oh, come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel.
That Christmas Village is going to be on the campus of Regent. Now, I want to say Regent singers are here, and Regent right now has 129 areas of study, both online and campus, including cybersecurity and nursing. It's been rated among the top 11% universities in our country, and there's a number 866-910-7615. And if you want to be a student, they'd be glad to welcome you as one of their students. But this choir is just one example of the excellence that we have at Regent. I'm really proud of them. All right, what you got?
Well, this December, the campus of CBN and Regent, as Pat mentioned, has been transformed into an enchanting place where the true meaning of the Christmas season is celebrated. You can immerse yourself in the ambience of a Christmas village, sample German holiday treats, and experience festive traditions for your whole family. The CBN Christmas Village is free and open to the public. The last 3 days are tonight and Friday night from 6 to 9 p.m. And then this Saturday, December the 15th, is Military Appreciation Day. And the Christmas Village is going to be open from noon to 9 p.m. with some special events to honor our military. So if you'd like more information and you're able to join us, go to cbn.com. It's all laid out there for you. Time for some email.
Let's go for it. All right.
This first one, Pat, comes from Roxanne, who says, I'm part of a healthcare workers union. I am so conflicted. What is the right thing to do? Support my union that protects my job or to be there for my patients? What does the Bible say about this? Is it biblical to go on strike?
Well, I don't think they had unions and strikes when the Bible was being written. But what I would think is your first duty as a healthcare provider is to your patients. And I would be shocked if a union would pull their members. I think that government workers shouldn't be part of a union. I think government union is wrong. I mean, private enterprise is the one thing, but to strike against the government is wrong. And I certainly think to strike against the hospital or to strike against the patients, leave patients without critical care would be unthinkable. So what do you say? What does the Bible say? Well, your first duty is to love your fellow man, and that's the way you do it. All right?
Okay, this is Kieran, who says, I am a strong believer, but I'm increasingly losing faith in myself. I constantly regret well-meaning decisions I make for myself. I just seem to end up more unhappy and feel like I've wasted years of my life. I've lost all self-confidence, and while all my friends enjoy themselves or settle down, I'm lonely inside. What should I do?
What you need to do is to take the Bible's appraisal of you and take it to heart. And the Bible says we're supposed to have our conscience cleansed from dead works that we would serve the living God. That other stuff is under the blood. Whatever you've done, confess it, put it away, and then get on with your life. And that's what the Lord says, that you may serve the living God. The reason you're on earth is to give glory to God. Man's chief aim is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. So stop mulling over the mistakes you've made. We've all made mistakes. There's not a single human who doesn't have plenty of screw-ups. I've got mine and you've got yours. But we don't dwell on them. We have our conscience cleansed from dead works to serve the living God. Okay.
Okay, this is Benica, who says, I'm afraid to read the Bible because I know that the world is coming to an end. When I think about it, I go into a panic attack. I start to worry about my children and other children when the chaos will begin. I won't be able to protect them from any of it. I'm afraid for my life and my children's lives. I'm crying at this moment thinking about it. Please help.
I don't know which version of the Bible you were reading, but how about you're reading the Psalms? They're not full of evil. Read the book of Ephesians and Corinthians. They're full of joy and praise. Read Revelation. There's some bad things in Revelation, but the end, the bottom of the end of the book, we win. God's triumph is always in the Bible. He will triumph over evil. And if you're part of his kingdom, the kingdom of God will triumph. Everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Of course you read the Bible. The Bible is full of hope and joy and praise. And I don't know who's giving you all this stuff. It must be in church that they're preaching all this doom and gloom. Sure that the earth one day is going to come to an end. Sure it's going to melt with fiery heat, but who cares? I mean, it's in God's hands. The thing that God says to us is, occupy till I come back. You should occupy and stop worrying about some things in the Bible, but you need to get in the Word and see what it says. Take those promises, the good stuff that's in there, and it's loaded with them, all right?
This is William, who says, we're taught that God forgives and forgets our sins when we repent of them. If so, why did God not forget Moses' sin when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it as he was told to? Moses wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because of that sin. It seems that God forgave his sin, but did not forget it.
You know, in the question of God forgiving, look, what did Moses do? He used the arm of the flesh, and he didn't glorify God. He was a leader of the people, and he didn't glorify God. You know, if you shoot somebody, God might forgive you, but you're still going to jail. You might get the electric chair. So you say, well, how come the country hadn't forgiven you and forgotten about it? You don't forget stuff like that. And that has nothing to do with God forgetting your sin. And for eternity, it has to do with temporal punishment. And what Moses didn't do, he did not speak the word which would glorify God, but he did use the arm of flesh, and he took his rock and struck and that rock was Jesus. And he was like, I'm striking Jesus instead of speaking the word which brought the worlds into being. But, you know, you don't expect God to forget the temporal punishment that you're involved in. We'll leave with today's power message from 1 John. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. Well, for Terry and all of us, this is Pat Robertson. Thank you so much for being with us. And Lord willing, this program will be on the air tomorrow. Don't miss a word of it. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.